The eternal work's burden. Year 10 or 11. I had stopped counting the way you stop counting your own heartbeats, not because they don't matter, but because if you listened to everyone, you'd never do anything else. Let me tell you what I had become by then, because I think you've earned the truth, and because the truth is simpler and worse than you might expect. I had become a machine. Input, a dying human. Process, open the door. Output, a departed soul. Repeat, repeat. Repeat until the word repeat wears smooth and falls off, and there is only the thing itself, the doing, with no edges left between one instance and the next. The ledger never stopped burning with names. I told you about the ledger, the true one, the one underneath, every living soul written in script that hurts to read. By year 10, I no longer needed to be shown it. I could feel it, always, a pressure at the base of whatever I had instead of a skull. The weight of who was coming. Roughly 150,000 a day. That is about 6,000 an hour. About 100 a minute. Almost 2 every second. Tick, tick, tick. The world's most morbid metronome, and I was the only one who could hear it, and it never, ever slowed. In the beginning, by which I mean those first few years when I still believed in beginnings, I had tried to be present for each one, to give every soul the dignity of a witnessed ending, a hand to hold, a voice that knew their name. Do you know what happens when you try to be meaningfully present for 2 deaths every second? You shatter. You spread yourself across the surface of all that dying until you are a millimeter thick and a world wide, and somewhere in the spreading you lose the thread of which piece is you. If there was ever a you, I am no longer certain there was. I am no longer certain I is a word that applies to whatever got up from that desk. Some nights, and I still called them nights, out of a habit that was itself a kind of ghost, I would be present at 1,000 deathbeds at once and not be able to find among those 1,000 sets of cold hands the ones that were mine. So I learned to choose. Not which souls rose and which fell. That was no longer mine, as you know by now. I chose which deaths got me, and which got only my key. I called it the schedule, when I still called things anything. It was my attempt to lay a grid over the bottomless, to pretend an avalanche could be filed. Children got all of me. Always. That was the first rule, and the one I never broke, not in those 10 years, not in the centuries since. Their doors were the most elaborate anyway, painted in colors that don't exist, plastered with stickers from shows that only ever aired inside their own heads, the handles set low at exactly the height of a small hand that would now never grow. For a child, I stopped. I stopped completely. I held the hand. I answered the questions. I walked them all the way to the threshold and did not let go until they did. Whatever was left of the man in me, I kept it alive on children, the way you keep a single coal banked through a long winter. It was the one place I refused to be a machine. The old who died alone got my presence too. They had earned it, surviving decades only to arrive at the end with no one in the room but death. I came early for them, sometimes hours early, and simply sat. They couldn't see me, couldn't hear me. But I have come to believe some of them sensed me anyway. A change in the air, a weight settling onto the edge of the bed, a peace arriving from nowhere in the last hour of a long and lonely life. It cost me time I did not have. I spent it anyway. It was the closest thing to prayer left to a creature like me. The sudden ones got my speed. Accidents, murders, the deaths that arrive before the dying have finished the sentence they were speaking. Those souls come loose confused, sometimes still trying to complete the motion that killed them, reaching for a wheel that's already gone, finishing a step off a curb that isn't there. They need someone immediately to catch them, to explain, to turn the panic into a door. So I was there immediately, always. And then there were the slow deaths, the ones in hospitals, with families gathered and the goodbyes already said, and every machine and every medicine already exhausted. Those, I am telling you the truth, remember, I promised you the truth. Those I learned to phone in. I would appear at the last possible second. Open the door. Move on. They had their people, I told myself. They had hands to hold that were warmer than mine, voices that had known them their whole lives and not just at the end. They didn't need death to sit a vigil. They had a room full of the living doing exactly that. It was efficiency, I told myself, not cruelty. It was triage, the cold arithmetic of an impossible job, the only way to give the children and the lonely and the blindsided what they needed without tearing myself into so many pieces that none of them got anything at all. I told myself a lot of things. I have noticed, I think I've said this before, that the stories we tell ourselves grow most elaborate exactly when they are least true. Because here is the part no grid laid over an avalanche ever fixes. There came a day, I won't pretend I know which one, they had long since stopped having edges, when I ran out of things to tell myself. I had just phoned in a death. A woman, old, alone after all, exactly the kind I had sworn I would always sit with, except that 3 children were dying in 3 different time zones in the same instant, and the arithmetic chose them over her, the way it always chose. I appeared at the last second. I opened her door. I did not hold her hand. And as I turned to go, I caught the look on her face. Not fear, not anger, just a small, final disappointment. The look of someone who had hoped, even now, even here, that she might matter enough to somebody to not be alone at the end. And something in me that had been bending for 10 years simply broke. I stopped. I don't mean I slowed down. I mean I stopped. I stood in that little room and I did not go to the next death, or the one after, or any of them. I let the metronome tick, 2 a second, and I answered none of it. I had had enough. Enough of the triage. Enough of the doors I could never fix. Enough of being a machine that abandoned the dying to spare itself the agony of being torn into 1,000 pieces. If this was the work, then I would not do the work. Let the Father do it himself, if it mattered so much to him. I sat down. Death, after 10 years, went on strike. I'll admit I spent the first while almost cheerful, imagining how it would go. I had been an administrator once. I knew how these things were meant to work. There would be a reprimand. The only question was the form, and I found, to my own surprise, that I could still be amused, because both forms were ridiculous. A written warning, perhaps. I had received one of those already at the desk in the old life, the Father's voice informing me that my next transgression would carry consequences. The thought of a second one, a formal note appended to the file of a creature who had already been handed the worst sentence in existence, struck me as very nearly funny. What would it threaten? More eternity? Or he could simply fire me, terminate the position. And here I caught myself almost hoping, because what would it mean to fire death? To relieve me of the post? There is only one way to relieve a thing like me of its duties, and its name is the very thing I had spent a decade handing out to everyone else. I would have signed any severance he cared to offer. Gladly. With both hands. Both comical, I thought, sitting there in my strike of one. A warning or a firing. I waited to see which it would be. It was neither. Because the Father, I understood at last, does not come down to the ground. He had passed his sentence from somewhere very high and very far away, and then he had withdrawn, the way a judge does not follow you into the cell to see how you're settling in. There would be no reprimand, because reprimands are for employees, and I was not an employee. I was a punishment being served. You do not issue a warning to a prison. You do not fire a sentence. He was not up there watching me refuse and deciding what to do about it. He was simply, serenely elsewhere. And that was the whole answer, and it was worse than any discipline could ever have been. Because while I sat there waiting for a punishment that was never coming, the dying went on dying without me. And the dead did not go anywhere. That was the thing I had not thought through in my magnificent refusal. When death stops, people still die. The metronome belongs to the Father, not to me. I only ever answered it. They came loose from their bodies, all of them, every soul whose date had arrived, and they stood up out of their own deaths and looked around for the door, for the hand, for the one who was supposed to be there. And no one was. So they stayed. I watched it happen. I watched them drift back to the people they had left, the husband, the daughter, the sleeping child, and try to touch them, try to speak, try to finish the sentence the dying never get to finish. I watched them understand, one after another, that no one could see them, that no one could hear them, that they had died and not been collected, and there was nowhere now to go, and no one left to take them. And I watched the first of them begin the long, patient, hopeless work I would see them at for centuries to come, standing in the corners of rooms that used to be theirs, reaching for the living, who walked through them like cold spots, like drafts, like nothing at all. That is how ghosts came to be. I want that on the record, alongside everything else. Not a curse, not some older, darker magic. Just a tired civil servant who decided for one stretch of 1 year that he would rather sit down than do his job, and a world that quietly filled with the people he left where they fell. The living have wondered about ghosts for as long as there have been ghosts to wonder about. I can tell you precisely what they are. They are my unanswered correspondence. They are the doors I did not open. Death, it turns out, has his fingers in a great many things, and the haunting of the world is one of them, and it is the one I am most ashamed of, because it is the only one I chose. I went back to work. Of course I did, not because the Father made me. He never lifted a finger, never said a word, and he never had to. I went back because I finally understood that my refusal had not punished him. It had not so much as touched him. It had only made ghosts. The strike had no victim but the dead and the haunted living, and so the grand gesture of my rebellion turned out to be just one more thing I was doing to people who had never done a thing to me. So I stood up. I picked up the key. I started opening doors again, 2 a second, and I have not stopped since. Not in all the long years between that one and this. But the ghosts I made in those weeks never left, and every time across all the centuries after that I came a half-second too late, and I came late more and more, as the work swelled and the world filled, a few more would join them. A scattering at first. I did not yet know that the scattering would become a sediment and the sediment a tide. But that is further on. That is a story for another time, and a far heavier one. I still had the one day. The Father's mercy, the cruel meal for the starving man. One day a year as a mortal, warm and tasting and holding things that turned to dust at midnight. The first one, you'll recall, simply ended. Midnight came, the warmth left my hands, and I was myself again, which is to say I was no longer myself at all. But the universe, it turns out, has a sense of humor, and somewhere in those 10 years it decided that a mortal day deserved a properly mortal ending. So the days stopped simply ending. By year 10, midnight came for me the way it comes for everyone. A bus I didn't see, a brick from a great height, a bad oyster. Once, memorably, a meteorite the size of a marble found me on an empty street with the whole sky to choose from. The odds were astronomical. That was the joke. Death, on his one day of life, struck down by the very thing he spends eternity collecting, and the universe laughing every year at how creatively it could manage it. I had stopped finding it funny, but I never doubted, after the meteorite, that someone found it hilarious. This is the thing they don't tell you about eternal labor, the thing the phrase, the burden of eternal work, can't carry on its own. The burden is not the work. Work is heavy, but work has an end. You set the stone down, you finish the harvest, you close the ledger, and go home. The burden is that this never ends, and never can. There is no last name on the last page that I will ever reach, because by the time I reached it, 10 more pages would have written themselves behind me. There is no finishing. There is no setting down. There is no going home, because home was a body and a name and a desk, and all 3 are dust. By year 10 I was very good at my work and almost entirely gone as a person. I have come to think those are the same fact. You cannot do this forever and remain someone. The doing sands you down. What's left is exactly enough to open the doors, and not one grain more, except for the children and the banked coal I keep for them, which is the only reason I can still tell you any of this in the voice of a man instead of the hum of a machine. There was, of course, the one way out. I had not forgotten it. By year 10 I had begun, in the half-second pauses between the deaths, to turn it over and over the way you worry a stone smooth in your pocket. Find a soul willing to take your place, knowingly, freely. 5 years of mortal life, and then this, all of it, the metronome, the schedule, the ghosts, the meteorites, the forever. I had asked on the day I was sentenced, who would ever agree to such a thing? 10 years in, I had refined the question. It was no longer who would agree. It was what kind of person could be brought to agree. What grief, what desperation, what particular and terrible love would make a human being look at this and say yes? And I had begun, God forgive me, to look for them. To watch the dying and the grieving not only as souls to be collected but as candidates. That is the part of the burden I am least proud of. Not the ghosts, not the phoned-in deaths. The fact that somewhere in year 10, I stopped only ending lives and started very quietly shopping for the one I could ruin in order to save myself. But that, the one who finally said yes, and what it cost him, is a story for another time. Tick, 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 to a second. It has not slowed in all the years since, not by a single beat. As I tell you this, somewhere, more than one of them is coming loose, reaching for a door, and some piece of me is there, opening it, on time or a half-second late. I have opened more doors than there are stars you can see, and more than there are stars you can't. The metronome has never once let me rest, and it never will, not until the page I cannot reach, on the day that will never come. That is the eternal work's burden, not that it is hard, that it is forever. End of episode 4.